Good morning, nerds. It is I. A few months ago, I made a video called Why Backstory Suck in Tabletop RPGs, and a few people have since pointed out that players are not the only ones who go too far with their backstory dumping. Game masters with their overly intricate settings can be just as guilty, and that's what we'll be discussing in this week's video. But before I give you a 1,000-year history of GMs overdoing their setting bibles, I have 3 buttons that I'd love it if you'd click, and those are like, subscribe, and the bell for notifications. Just so we're all on the same page. Worldbuilding is either the act or the product of creating a fictional world, often called a setting. This will usually include things like the history, the geography, the cultures, the names of important people and places, and even things like custom magic systems or constructed languages. Worldbuilding can be done for any fictional world for really any creative purpose, or for no purpose at all, for pure enjoyment. But in this video, we'll be focusing on worldbuilding for tabletop RPGs specifically. Throughout this video, I will be referring to setting bibles as a catch-all term for any document used by a GM to store notes on their worldbuilding. This setting bible could take the form of thoughts in the GM's head, a notebook with idle scrawlings, a private wiki with hyperlinked pages, or just an obnoxiously long MS Word document. But no matter what form it takes, we'll be calling it a setting bible. A few quick notes on worldbuilding for RPGs specifically. The first is that settings for RPG campaigns are usually made by the game master, and this is a process usually done out of session, either before or during the campaign. It can be done collaboratively with the players, it can even be done improvised in session, but by default it is done by the GM in their own time. And finally, there's the matter of pre-built versus homebrew settings. A lot of RPGs come with a setting baked into the rules that has been world built for you. This could either be a setting built for that RPG, like Galarian for Pathfinder and the Dark Future for Cyberpunk, or it could be one adapted over from another medium, like the Alien RPG uses the universe of the Alien films. But even when RPGs don't have a pre-built setting, they often have what's called an implied setting, a series of assumed norms that any homebrew worldbuilding the GM does is expected to fall within. So for instance, a fantasy RPG might have elves, dwarves, and halflings existing as races as one of its assumed norms. So, we know what worldbuilding is, we know who does it, where it comes from. How does it get from the GM to the players? It can be conveyed in a number of ways, and as we'll see, almost all of them have some issue with them. The first broad category of methods that you can use are those that can be classified as GM lore dumps. This is where the GM gives world information to the players in a manner where it is obvious that the GM is giving world information to the players. We will discuss more subtle methods later on. I would break this down into 4 key categories. The first is just exposition narrated by the GM. Your characters would know that Castle Kelric was built by old Lord Liam Kelric 338 years ago, in the time of King Sigmund II. Yada yada yada. This is the most obtrusive, most out-of-character way to convey information to the players, and for this reason, it is rightfully reviled. The second method is to have that narration delivered as dialogue by an NPC voiced by the GM. Good morning, welcome to Castle Kelric. It was built by Lord Liam Kelric 338 years ago, in the time of King Sigmund II, blah blah blah. This is obviously in character, but it is still very obtrusive. The third option is for the GM to provide some sort of handout, such as either their entire setting bible or some subsection of lore notes that they can hand to their players for reading at their own time. Alright players, here are the notes on the history of Castle Kelric. Please look through them. It is assumed that your characters know everything that is in that handout. This is not as obtrusive, but it is still out of character, and it has the downside of being inherently optional, which means it's very likely that the players just won't engage with it. Finally, there is the diegetic handout, diegetic being a fancy word for in-world. As you search through the castle's library, you find a small, dusty book. Its leather-bound cover reads, "On the history of Castle Kelric." Most of the pages are rotted and worm-eaten, but the introductory pages at the front of the book remain legible. Alright players, I will put the contents of the Castle Kelric book in the handouts folder. You can look at it in your own time. There we go. This method, again, in character, again, not obtrusive, but again, very much optional. It also has the slight disadvantage that in-character communication is generally less efficient than out-of-character communication. All of these methods have the player being very much reliant on the game master. If the game master doesn't give the players information, they cannot learn it. If the players never visit Castle Kelric, never meet whoever that French person was, or never receive any of those handouts, they will have no idea of the castle's history. But in some cases, there are ways for players who like taking the initiative to learn information in their own time. There are two methods, and both only really work for RPGs with pre-built settings. The first is lore chapters. Most RPGs with a pre-built setting will have a gazetteer, lore summary kind of thing in their core rulebook that players can look through to help them understand what the setting actually is. This is of course dependent on A, the players actually reading the rulebook, which is never a guarantee, and 2, them then reading enough of the rulebook to read the lore chapter. The other way is through third-party media. If the RPG is based on a film series, you can watch the films. If it's based on books, you can read the books. If it's a really famous RPG setting, like the World of Darkness, Galarian, the Forgotten Realms, or something else, then there will be plenty of YouTube videos about it simply because the RPG is popular. Now, on the one hand, these sorts of third-party media are probably the most accessible to players, and so for anyone who has even a little bit of motivation, it is a good way to learn about a setting. On the other hand, it requires that the setting either be pre-existing or famous enough that somebody has decided to dedicate their time to make lore videos about it. So in many cases, it simply won't be possible. The final method is environmental storytelling. I have an entire video about this, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but essentially it's small, half-explained details in the world that players can interact with. They generally aren't fully explained, but with a little bit of deduction, the PCs can figure out what they are and make their own inferences about what this says about the world. It's a great trick, I love using it, and you should too. Once you finish this video, go watch that other video about it. Now I know this video is called Why World Building Sucks in RPGs, but let's be fair here. People wouldn't waste so much effort on their settings if there wasn't at least some value to be got out of that effort. The first and most elemental of the arguments in favor of world building is that without it, a tabletop RPG is basically unplayable. You would have no locations for the players to visit, no NPCs for them to interact with, no ecology of monsters for them to fight, none of that. And so no matter what, some minimum amount of world building is always necessary. You can have a player character with no backstory still be a decent character, but you can't have an RPG campaign without a setting be a good campaign. Second, speaking of those player characters, good world building provides a very robust framework for players to build their characters into. As long as the players actually know what the setting is and have the right information to sort their characters in, they can do a much better job of integrating their characters into the world and by extension immersing themselves into the game. If players are going to have detailed backstories, as much as I don't like them, well, having them tie into the world at least makes those backstories useful. And of course, players aren't the only ones who can build cool things out of world building. GMs can too. In my Dark Sun video that I made last year, I talked about the adventurability of a setting. And that is that a well-designed tabletop RPG setting naturally creates fodder for the sorts of adventures, missions, scenarios, call them what you want, that player characters are likely to go on. I talk about Dark Sun in more detail in that actual video, but suffice it to say, it has a lot of things like, ruins that the PCs can visit for the classic AD&D dungeon crawl experience. There is an inbuilt conflict into the setting, with the decline of King Karlach and the city of Tyr, and a lot of interesting groups for the players to interact with and potentially even influence. And finally, in-depth world building provides a certain richness to the setting that mere player interaction simply can't. It can give a sense that the world itself is larger and older than the stuff that the players are interacting with, and that there is always more for them to do and explore. If you only ever make the bare minimum amount of world building to make each session run to the bare minimum extent, then your world can not only feel very flat and dull, but it can also give the players a degree of egocentrism, that the entire world revolves around them. And egocentric players can end up being nightmare fuel for the GM. But it's not all sunshine and roses. There is a reason I called this video Why World Building Sucks, and now we are finally getting to those reasons. We spoke earlier about the ways that GMs can give information. If the GM gives too much information to their players in one go, or if that information simply isn't relevant to the players in that current moment, then it can be both incredibly tedious and incredibly overwhelming. The players may zone out, they may get confused, or they may hyperfixate on one tiny irrelevant detail of what you told them, and send themselves off on a wild goose chase for what seems to be absolutely no reason. When people complain about lore dumps, this is what they're complaining about. The next problem is that overly rigid world building can end up restricting player autonomy. Now, on some level, I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. As I talked about in my video on player autonomy, I think that some people turn it into a bit more of a sacred cow than it actually is. Most players don't want to be deciding things like what the entire campaign is or what the next adventure will be. They would rather just have an adventure handed to them that they can then use as a springboard for their character's own actions. But when it comes to their character's own actions, they really want autonomy. If your world has very strict class hierarchies, gender roles, rituals and courtesies that have to be obeyed, all of that will dig further and further and further into a player's action-to-action, what I call tactical autonomy. And more than anything else, that will infuriate them. I give this example of, say, rigid social structures eating into player tactical autonomy, but there is a better example of how world building can kill adventurability and player freedom. And that's pre-built settings where everything is centered on a particular story or meta plot. A good example of this would be something like Tolkien's Legendarium, from the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, and the Lord of the Rings. A lot of the key historical elements of Middle-earth are already laid out in the Silmarillion, and most of the world information that we have for the Third Age of Middle-earth revolves around the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. It's some incredibly detailed stuff. Tolkien did a lot of great work on that setting, but the fact that so many gaps, like what Gandalf was doing between the end of The Hobbit and the start of Fellowship, or what was happening to the Men of Dale during the War of the Ring, the fact that so many of these gaps already have things to fill them in makes it a lot harder for a GM to carve out a niche for their players to explore in and influence. And this despite the existence of the One Ring RPG, the second edition of which I actually backed. I have the core rulebook, the standard edition, not the leather bound. I have the starter set box set. I have the dice, including the extra Sauron dice, and even the misprint dice, because I kept those. I have the gamemaster screen, and my favourite thing that I have are cloth maps of Eriador and the Shire. The products that Free League have made for this system are incredibly beautiful. The mechanics are decent, although they are slightly rules light for my personal taste, and they really have done everything they can to give the player heroes room to go on adventures. But with the Third Age being so ring-centric, there was only so much they could do. Yet, even if you make your own setting as a GM, and even if you make it with adventuring PCs in mind, the stuff that you make and the stuff that your players want you to make are not always the same thing. Especially if a GM has already put a lot of time and effort into building their setting before the campaign even starts, they can end up obligating themselves to use all the material they've made, and this can come to the player's detriment. There are so many GM bad habits, like lore dumping, railroading, and injecting their favourite special NPCs into everything, that can be neatly explained by the GM thinking that if they don't use that one piece of lore that they wrote 3 months ago, that all of their time and effort will be wasted. And speaking of high-effort world building, the act of building out a setting can be such a drain on GM time and creativity, especially for new aspiring GMs, that their campaigns never get off the ground. Sooner or later, in GM circles, you encounter someone who is really excited to get their campaign started, really excited, it's going to be so amazing, but they want to finish their world first. And in many cases, that campaign will never be started. And all because of their world building. But, I hear you say, perhaps the GM could deal with these issues by getting their players to collaborate with them on the world building. And indeed, yes, there are ways to do this. And these ways are very imaginatively named collaborative world building. It's a concept that's often conflated with collaborative storytelling, with both having their roots in The Forge, which was an RPG forum from the late 90s to the early 2000s, where a lot of the philosophy around story gaming first developed. And very simply, the idea is that as a GM, rather than writing all the world building stuff yourself, you ask your players to help you. You can do this in or out of sessions, and in some cases you can even just delegate entire sections of world building to one or more of your players. Here's an example. I was once in a Cyberpunk Red campaign that switched systems over to Savage Worlds. Now, Cyberpunk Red campaigns are traditionally set in Night City. Night City being a fictitious city developed for that universe that's situated in Morro Bay in Northern California. You can actually find the spot where it's meant to be on Google Maps, which I've actually found to be pretty helpful for figuring out the distance from it to other spots in the state for various little things that I've done. And that's all very well, but it wouldn't help us all that much. You see, not long after we switched over the systems, we ended up switching locations too, as events in the campaign forced our characters to flee town from Night City all the way to Miami, Florida. Now, there's pretty much zero information from our Telsorian games on what the city of Miami is like in the year 2045 of the dark future. So, we had to come up with all of that detail ourselves. The GM preferring player-heavy, improv-driven play, he didn't want to be the one taking the helm on figuring out all of Neo Miami's details, and so that fell down onto us. And I have to give credit here to one of the players who world built every single criminal gang in Neo Miami. The player in question was a massive fan of crime films, and he leveraged all of his knowledge to divide up the city into different gang territories. Each gang had a name, a leader, a culture. There was the Japanese Yakuza. There were South American cartels. There were straight up pirate gangs. There were party gangs, corporate-sponsored gangs, so many gangs. All of them had fleshed out identities, complex relationships to one another, and a lot of cool little details that we were able to exploit throughout the rest of that campaign. It wasn't just him who did the world building for Neo Miami, the rest of us chipped in too. I, for one, designed a lot of the corporations that held sway in the Sunshine State. But I bring up this player in particular, because although his world building was truly brilliant, and I'm still, years later, in awe of what he was able to create, he would not be around long enough to benefit from it. You see, this player was always very argumentative. He had been like that from the start, and over time things only got worse. Once we actually moved the campaign over to Miami and started playing in the world that we'd all built together, he became more and more angry at the decisions that the other player and I were making about what our characters should be doing. He wanted to keep doing traditional edge runner stuff, while the other player and I saw an opportunity to climb the political ladder in the city of Miami and experience a very different sort of story. Our good friend the world builder was none too happy with us, and quite a few of our sessions would start with a half-hour long argument as we all had to shout him down into submitting to our plans. Then, one week, I missed a session. I had injured my ankle the day before, and I had been GMing a one-shot for a West Marches server that finished an hour before that session was meant to start. Now, neither of these things on their own would have made me miss that session, but the two of them together left me absolutely exhausted, and so I decided to sit the session out. When I checked Discord a couple of hours later, I found that that player had rage quit the campaign. I spoke to him about it in DMs the next day, and he gave me the answer that I was expecting about why he left the group, that he was still angry about the direction the campaign had taken. And so to this day, I look back on him with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I am incredibly grateful for the world building he did. He did a truly incredible job. But for Pete's sake, could the man not have calmed down? Anyway, back to collaborative world building. It does have its advantages. It really can take pressure off the GM and provide them with ideas that they would never have thought of. Again, that one guy knew a lot about crime films, more than the rest of us, and his contributions were invaluable. It can even increase player investment in the campaign because they have personal ownership over the elements of the world. But interestingly, this only works if the players are already very invested in the campaign. If they're much more casual about it, then all of this is just the GM giving the players homework. And finally, this can all just end up being a bit of a hassle for the GM. Having to reach out to players, make a request for some world building detail they want, wait for the players to reply, review what they've given you, send them feedback, discourse back and forth until you've got a good world building solution. All of that takes time. In my current Cyberpunk Red campaign, one of my goals was to bring in more collaborative world building because it's something I've never really done before and that I wanted to try. And so what I started doing is, a couple of days before the session, sending players DMs saying, hey, I need this NPC or I need this detail for an upcoming session, can you give me some ideas? Now, I would have to do this days in advance to give them enough time for everything to happen. This meant that I would have to start prepping days in advance of what I wanted to, and that's just dragged the whole process out. If I needed a very particular detail about an NPC for session prep notes, and I didn't have the details of that NPC yet, well, I was stuck in a holding pattern. And if the players didn't get back to me at all, well, I just have to make the NPC myself. I did this all of 3 times. I did admittedly get some, decent NPCs, one of whom is now a regular recurring NPC out of this experience. But honestly, if I need an NPC, if I need a location, if I need some setting detail, it's just quicker and easier to make it myself. I know what I want, I know how to make it fit into what I'm planning, it's just easier for me to do it this way. But speaking of making things easier, world building doesn't always have to be pre-planned. You can absolutely improv world building. There have been a number of times in my current Cyberpunk campaign where players have gone looking for, say, a clothing shop or a cafe. Rather than pre-building a whole bunch of these, I've just made them up on the fly as needed. Given that these are fairly minor world building details, they aren't worth me spending my prep time on, and they can be fleshed out to a satisfactory degree with nothing but brain power. This generally relies on some degree of implied setting. If you know what's vaguely meant to be in a location, it's much easier to improvise what the fine details of that location should be. And so by combining what basically amounts to shower thoughts with even a medium amount of creativity, you can massively cut down on the amount of time that it takes you to flesh your world out, and you can make sure that the stuff you need is actually relevant to the session at hand, because that's what it's being made for. But of course, this does have its issues. If you over-rely on improvisation for your world building, then your setting can end up feeling incomplete and incoherent. It can also lead to the aforementioned player egocentrism. If the players think the world revolves around them, they will start acting more brazenly, more abrasively, more impulsively, and that will cause issues for your campaign. It can also break the immersion for them. If they ever realize that there isn't actually anything on the other side of the big dark forest, that can make the world feel incredibly artificial. And again, we don't want that. The final note here is that improvisation versus pre-planning of a setting is very much on a spectrum. Most GMs will inevitably end up using a mix of both, but what the exact mixture is will be up to them. So, after all of this, if worldbuilding sucks so much, how do you unsuck your world building? I would start by building out the bare bones of your setting and making sure that you have plenty to improvise around. This can end up being very low effort, a lot of implied setting stuff, but it can even look surprisingly high effort. This here that I'm putting up on slide is a regional map that I made for a Burning Wheel campaign that ultimately never materialized. It's meant to be the southernmost province of the main kingdom. Yes, the names are in French. I based the setting on 14th century France. One, because I thought it would be cool, and two, because I actually wanted to use my degree for once. Now, there are something like 90 manorial estates listed on this map, and absolutely none of them have any detail in my world building notes. They needed to exist to make the world feel filled in, to make the duchy as large and influential as it was meant to be. But places like Trois Buttes or Vierge really didn't need any detail beyond their names, at least until the PCs tried to visit them. And honestly, putting the labels on the map really only took me a couple of hours. It wasn't that difficult. And I got to have a little fun with it. We've got up in the northeast some fun buttes jokes. Butte is the French word for hill, but it looks like a very different word in English. What can I say? I like big hills and I cannot lie. There's also some funny little gags. You have Vierge next to Voyou, Virgins next to Thugs. And if you actually speak French like some of my friends do, then you will notice what all of those little gags are. And when you're making all of your world-building details, focus them around what's actually relevant to what the PCs are going to be doing. That aborted campaign was going to be all about feudal politics and court intrigue, and so I needed a feudal system for the campaign to operate in, hence all of the manorial estates. Likewise, if you're going to be making a cyberpunk campaign that's all about nomads, make sure you have a lot of very detailed nomad packs laid out, all their territories, the routes they travel, their insignias, their memberships, all of that stuff. Have all of that squared away, because you are going to need it. Don't make irrelevant crap. In my current cyberpunk campaign that's set in a reclaimer town that's just outside Night City, I've put a decent amount of effort into that reclaimer town, in bringing it to life and giving it all the details it needs. I have put basically no effort into fleshing out Night City. There is very little info about modern Night City in the book, and I've only used a tiny fraction of even that. Mostly because, well, I haven't needed to. The campaign only occasionally ventures into Night City. As for the stuff you're making, drip feed it to your players. Don't just dump exposition on the players with an industrial excavator. Plop it in over time with a hand trowel. Again, focus on the stuff that is immediately relevant to them. Most of the methods that you can use to get information to your players are in some way inelegant, but if the players have a genuine motive to care about the information you're giving them, they can put up with the imperfections. Trust me. If there's any meta plot or conflict that's intrinsic to the setting, keep it open-ended. I talk about this in my Dark Sun video and the tier meta plot. There are, I found out, a series of books called The Prison Pentad, all about that storyline, but you can ignore everything in The Prison Pentad, and the setting will still work. Make sure that the same is true of your own setting. And finally, I'm going to get a bit controversial. Don't be afraid to have your worldbuilding place slight restrictions on what the players can do. Emphasis on slight. It will actually force them to be more creative, and it'll make the setting more impactful than just a millimeter thick coat of paint on top of the RPG rule set. Again, light touches, don't railroad your players, but do use the setting to put them in interesting and difficult situations. And it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, share it with your friends, and leave a comment down below. What are your tips for world building? And what are some of your favourite RPG settings that have been pre-built? If you'd like to see more videos like this one, then please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. It really does help the channel. And once more, thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you next, farewell.